today. Vedomosti newspaper, are you with us today? Please state your presence. I can't see you, neither can I hear you. Now I can hear you. Madam Zakharova, you already mentioned today the situation with Norway. Please state if the Russian MFA is doing anything to decrease tensions in regards to the relations with that country. We understand that there's some contradictions, that there's some disagreements. The tensions increases. They say in Norway that they need to negotiate with Russia. If the statement of Prime Minister of Norway could be interpreted like that, what are the steps the Russian MFA takes to alleviate the situation? The situation in our relations is at its lowest point. This has happened because of the actions in Norway. We did nothing to deteriorate our relations, which cannot be said for Norway. This is not our fault, and we don't need to take any measures to alleviate the situation. What we can really do to do it, because the situation is being worsened because of the efforts of the other side. There have been no messages from the Norway side testifying to the Oslo's desire to change the situation or stabilize it. We're not witnessing any attempts. On the contrary, and I've already mentioned it today, that Norwegian authorities have unleashed an anti-Russian campaign which targets the Russian tourists detained in the country. Currently, 3 tourists have been detained, and our diplomatic missions are interacting with them and are controlling the questions of their defense. We have commented on Norway's efforts to increase military presence in its territory, especially near the border with Russia. We have mentioned it and provided facts today. This is another destructive step in that direction on the part of Norway. It is what it is, so that's how I would formulate it. If that's all, we are going further. Is CNN News India with us today? Is CNN News 18 India with us today? Your colleagues? CNN News 18 India. They are not with us. Is Regnum with us today? Yes, good afternoon. Yes, we'll first give the word to India.
One question. This is regarding India's import of crude oil that is happening in the last several months. It has increased several times, but there are reports that it has decreased in the recent weeks. Could you confirm that report? And also about this annual meet that happens between India and Russia, where Indian Prime Minister Modi is supposed to go to Moscow this time. Will that meeting still happen? Or will the Prime Minister Modi and President Putin will be meeting on the sidelines of G20? Could you please confirm?
Ну, что касается организации встреч на высшем уровне.
As for the meetings on the highest level, this is coordinated through the line of the President's administration of the Russian Federation. If we're talking about cooperation between India and Russia, this has been traditionally built on mutual respect and trust and careful consideration for the national interests of each country. We are preserving the intensity of cooperation on the highest level, in bilateral format, on the key international fora. Contrary to the illegal Western sanctions, the volumes of our trade have grown, and we are fulfilling our contracts in key areas and still building contacts in the area of culture, science, and technology. If you have any additional questions, I'm ready to answer them. You had one more question, I think. Please connect the journalist from India, if you could. You had one more question, as far as I recall. You had one other question, I think. Is that right? As far as I understand, yeah, the question regarding the imports from import of crude oil. I can say that if I got this question correctly, regarding the shipments of Russian oil and gas to India is one of the most important avenues of our cooperation with India in the area of energy. We have a common goal to make this cooperation as mutually beneficial for both countries as possible. The actions in that direction are checked and harmonized through our relevant agencies. We are not limited by the traditional, for the Western capitalism, that's the paradigm of maximizing profit, which is brutally capitalist paradigm. It is important for us to preserve the spirit of Russian and Indian friendship, which is expressing itself in the form of our especially privileged strategic partnership. We are firmly convinced that our both countries will not infringe upon the interest of the other. We recommend our colleagues not to trust speculations circulating in the media regarding the establishment of price limits on oil. Clear statements regarding this or that state's positions could be made based on its real actions. Did you have any other questions? Colleagues from India, do you have any other questions? Very well. I thought I heard him asking a question. Now we are moving forward to Regnum Agency.
Добрый день.
Good day. I have the following question. Serbian authorities say that during the recognition of independence of the DNR and the LPR, Russia was guided by the Kosovo president, and this led to increased Western pressure on Belgrade. And now, according to Serbian authorities, the US and the EU want to make Serbia swiftly recognize Kosovo in order to put this argument out of the hands of Russia. Was it really the case? Was Russia guided by the Kosovo president during the joining of the DPR and the LPR, as well as Kherson and Zaporozhye regions? Do you use this notion of Kosovo president in your diplomatic practice? And does this situation around Kosovo has any similarity with these new Russian regions? You have a very big question, so let me answer in a comprehensive way, because we're talking about a whole gamut of problems that are united with one simple phrase. With regard to the referenda and their results, of importance is the principle of a balance between the territorial integrity and the right of peoples to self-determination. We have repeatedly noted that. let us consider that the right to self-determination, just like any other international rights, were enshrined in Article 1 of the UN Charter. It was reaffirmed in Article 1 of the 1966 Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, as well as Article 1 of the 1966 Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. The Declaration of the Principles of International Law that has to do with diplomatic relations and cooperation between states in line with the UN Charter. And let me remind you, we are talking about the document of 1970. This document highlights the principle of sovereign equality of states that includes inviolability of territorial integrity and political independence, as well as equality and self-determination of peoples. At the same time, the Declaration highlights that during interpretation, the application of the basic principles of international law, one should be guided by the fact that they are interconnected, and every principle should be considered in light of other principles. If we talk about this in more simple words, this is not a buffet where a person just does the cherry picking and he chooses what he pleases to choose, and he doesn't pick what he doesn't want to. That is not the case. These are all interconnected things. When it comes to the balance between the principle of territorial integrity and the right to self-determination, it raises a lot of debates and issues, and this matter has been addressed in the 1970 Declaration in the following way. Everybody who argues in this regard and has this debate, let me reiterate once again, this declaration, dated 1970, reaffirms the inviolability, and I quote, of territorial integrity or political unity of sovereign and independent states that in their actions abide by the principle of equality and self-determination of peoples, end of quote. And the next quote, and hence have governments that represent, regardless of the race, religion, or color of skin, the whole of people living in this territory. And end of quote. This logic was voiced not incidentally, and it was voiced and embedded in other documents, for instance, the Vienna Declaration of the World UN Conference on Human Rights of 1993, when we are told that 1970s, 1960s, there was the decolonization process. You shouldn't pick the documents that you choose. But in 1993, on the verge of these events that had nothing to do with decolonization processes in the European space, there was this decision of the Vienna Declaration of the UN Conference on Human Rights, and it emphasized that the states that claim to defend the principle of territorial integrity and political unity should have, and I quote, a government that represents the interests of the whole people in its territory without any difference, end of quote. Clearly, now let's get back to the situation around Ukraine. Who could be considered such kind of government in Kiev? Who is representing the whole of the Ukrainian people without any separation and division? The only thing they were doing is, for many years, highlighting the difference between people on various grounds. They were segregating people, that's one thing. And second thing, who could be considered a national government that represents the whole of people? This should be decided during the election if we're talking about a democracy, and that is the kind of a political order that is enshrined in the relevant documents of Ukraine. And in this case, the government came to power as a result of a coup d'etat, and it was funded and supported in military terms by the country's external countries. And this government represents not the people of Ukraine in all its diversity. These governments represent the interests of foreign countries, companies, governments, firms, companies, and everything else that did not meet the interests of meet the principles of the international law. Let me emphasize once again, instead of representing the interests of people, if we're talking about 2014, since 2014, these people have been engaged in war against their own population, and this has turned into the stage of a military conflict. And the authorities after 2014 have been implementing military means against their own people, as well as economic suffocation. The mentioned declaration of 1970 emphasizes, and I quote, "the creation of a sovereign and independent state, a free joining to an independent state, or joining of it and association with it, or establishing any other political status that is freely determined by the people, is a form of carrying out by these people of the right to self-determination." End of quote. Now let's move on to the qualification of referenda in line with the Constitution of Ukraine. It has no influence whatsoever on their qualification under the international law. Let us wait till Regnum joins us once again. I can hear you and I can see you. So once again, let me highlight that the qualification of referenda in line with the legislation and the Constitution of Ukraine, it has no link whatsoever to the qualification under international law. The practice shows that the implementation of this right of people to self-determination by separation and joining with other states due to objective reasons cannot be carried out in line with national legislation, and it has the relevant wordings in the international law. It was reaffirmed by the International Court of Justice, the accordance with the international law of the Unilateral Declaration of Independence in respect to Kosovo. That is an advisory opinion, and according to it, the common international law does not have a ban that would be applicable to declarations on independence. End of quote. With regard to Kosovo, we make reference to the decisions, to the international legal decisions that were adopted by international legal bodies, and that is the matter. The Kosovo incident gave rise to a number of international legal notions, and we make reference to these notions, to these definitions. It is not confined to a single case. They give a general paradigm, a general description that has to do with other cases. At the same time, with regard to the memorandum that was presented to the court by the US stated that the Declaration of Independence may and basically often violates the international law. However, it doesn't mean that a violation of the international law took place. The UK, in its memorandum, highlighted that, in general, the international law does not ban exit or separation. It does not guarantee integrity of the preceding state from internal movements that lead to division or independence that is supported by the relevant peoples. End of quote. So this is not a private opinion by British or American politicians. It was not a slip of the tongue by Biden or Truss. And in this case, everybody says, well, you understand that how we can make reference to their words, you understand their state. Here we're talking about the position of a state within the international legal process. At the same time, when it comes to Kosovo, unlike former Ukrainian territories, it pertained to the act that was adopted by the Parliament of the Republic. I'm talking about an interim institute of self-governance. On the 17th of February 2008, it declared Kosovo's independence unilaterally. When I hear the same statements, whether the Kosovo president is a precedent for the referenda in Donbass and so on, I would like to remind you that with regard to this issue that we are discussing, there have been no referenda whatsoever in Kosovo. How can you call a precedent when there was no referendum in Kosovo? With regard to Crimea, Donetsk and Luhansk, these referenda did take place there. As for the international legal assessment that was given by the international legal institutions and the direct participants to these events, we do have these assessments and we can relate to them. With regard to the referenda, the DPR and the LPR, let me remind you, they were sovereign and independent states. They were recognized by Russia by the decrees of the president on the 21st of February 2022. At the same time, the DPR and the LPR were recognized by Syria on the 29th of June 2022, by North Korea on the 13th of July 2022, by Abkhazia and South Ossetia. The republics had international treaties, for instance with the Russian Federation, treaties on friendship, cooperation and mutual assistance. It is also important that the DPR and the LPR for the first time had this referenda on independence in 2014 for the first time. And I do remember the attention of the media, international media, whether these results would be considered as an action plan. Let me remind you the reasons behind this referenda. Back in the day, Ukraine had a coup d'etat with the use of force that resulted in a number of oppressive measures against new authority, against their citizens. And in line with the legal framework of the Ukrainian state, we saw that there was infringement of the rights and freedoms of national minorities, squeezing of the Russian language from the daily life, persecution of civil society, attacks on the freedom of expression, freedom of religion. And this was the opposite thing to what has been enshrined in the international law with respect to the territorial integrity and sovereignty of states. I'm talking about equal representation of peoples within a single country. For 8 years, this international recognition of independence of the republics has not been raised, given that the Minsk package of measures that was adopted by the UNSC Resolution 2202, and it envisaged the constitutional reform in Ukraine with entry into force by the end of 2015 of a new constitution that envisaged as a key element decentralization, as well as adoption, and I quote, of permanent legislation on special statutes of certain areas of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, end of quote. This should have envisaged the linguistic self-determination, participation of local self-governance, and the appointment of prosecution officers and the courts of these regions.
So if Ukraine had fulfilled its obligations, which were signed by its leaders, its commitments even, under the package of measures, as outlined above, it would have been possible to say that DPR and LPR had the conditions for the exercise of the rights to self-determination within the state of which they were a part at that time. But that did not happen due to Kiev's sabotage of the package of measures and the course taken by the Kiev regime to suppress the rights of the residents of Donbass by force. And when they say that it's all our assessment, it's not true. Ukraine's top leadership made no secret of the lack of even an intention to adhere to the Minsk agreements. The former president, Poroshenko, repeatedly stated that he had authorized the signing of this package of measures with the only purpose of buying time to strengthen the country's army. So you can have a look at the Poroshenko's interview with the Polish newspaper Gazeta Wyborcza, published on February 15, 2020. So this is a person who was there. He was an active party who elaborated these agreements and who signed these agreements. The tragic context is also the fact that the Kiev regime, with the approval of the West, established a blockade of Donbass, stopped the payment of pensions and social benefits, made it impossible to conduct normal economic activities, and prevented the delivery of humanitarian aid, which created unbearable living conditions for the population, incompatible with the exercise of the right to self-determination within one country, with Kiev. Similarly, in 2022, the population of the Zaporozhye and Kherson regions was also deprived of any prospect of self-determination within Ukraine as a result of incessant forceful measures taken against them by Kiev. So they could not enjoy their basic rights, including the right to life, inside Ukraine. As you know, the questions at the referendums in Zaporozhye and Kherson regions were articulated as follows. Are you in favor of the succession of Zaporozhye Kherson region from Ukraine and the formation of Zaporozhye Kherson region as an independent state and its incorporation into the Russian Federation as an entity of the Russian Federation? Thus, the respective subject on the basis of referendum and further on, using its sovereign right, initiates this initiative to be a part of the Russian Federation. So don't believe these simple words, these formulations. The West countries like such formulas, such injected stories in order to simplify its own manipulations. That's the international legal part. If we talk about tweets or memes, some funny pictures, we can simplify everything up to such an absurd. And then it will be no surprising that this leads to such kind of problems. So further on. So is channel Respublika Moldova, Publica TV with us? Moldova. Do we have Moldovan channel? If not, so we then proceed. Is Raitor here? Yes. Good afternoon, Madam Zakharova. We have two questions, and I would like to make some clarification, and I cannot answer. There were reports about resumption of the grain deal. This was first stated by the President of Turkey, Mr. Dagan, and then the Russian side reaffirmed. Maybe the Russian ministry has some prompt comment. We fully trust the Ministry of Defense, and this comment was made by my colleague. So all the information has already been submitted by the Minister of Defense. If we have some additions or you have some additional questions, you can send them to us and we will answer them if we have any additional information. Thank you. And then some other issues. You've started your briefing by stating about the call of the British ambassador to the MFA of Russia. So my question concerns this. I refer to accusations of Britain of attacks on Nord Streams. So apart from this call of ambassador, does Russia prepare some further measures in respect of Great Britain? And what will they consist of? And as for the proofs, many officials were asked, maybe you know any proofs that Great Britain was involved in these emergencies or terrorist acts, as they are called in Russia. Will these proofs be presented to the public? You have many questions, so if I don't answer all of them, please remind me of them. Of course, no doubts. the involvement of the British Secret Services in the terrorist attack on the Black Sea Fleet base in Sevastopol on October 29 this year and the sabotage of the northern streams will not go unanswered. We talked about this in the Security Council as well as in the public. So the British ambassador will be called to the Russian ministry. And I can answer you that the basic documents that will be handed over to the British side, the public will know them. Let me follow. I'm not talking about formalities, but a kind of procedural issues. So as soon as this meeting, one ambassador is here in the ministry, so we will share the information with you. It will be published on our website and in social media. By the way, we also mentioned the reaction of the British Defense Ministry did not go unnoticed. They try to deny responsibility, taking into account, it's very strange, taking into account the numerous facts confirming the direct involvement of British specialists, and they know in advance answers to all questions. The fact that this was an attack, so nobody has doubts in it. This fact is confirmed. It is fixed, taking into account that the British and the that this region has a lot of equipment, including drones, satellites, and some other equipment within this area. So they know very well. So, and they do not deny the fact of this attack. They talked about that they have nothing to do with it. They are not involved in this. Maybe we can be interested, they can be interested in what facts we possess. So they compromise themselves by this prompt statement of that they were not involved. So this once again can prove that the British side revealed themselves. So, but we are polite, so all the materials, all the documents proving involvement of British specialists in the preparation and implementation of this terrorist attack will be submitted to the British side. Another important moment is that, as you know, many asked, the so-called terrorist act, or as you call it, terrorist act, this is a zone of where the humanitarian operation is realized, even if it was a commercial program or just a civil infrastructure. And in this case, even this is an attack with the use of these means qualified this way, because deliberate destruction of civilian infrastructure is qualified this way. So the situation is even worse here, because it's the zone where the humanitarian operation is implemented, which the whole community monitors. And so we were outraged. We were even outraged by, and our representative to the UN, Mr. Nibenza, that the lack of any reaction, the UN reaction to this attack, we need to remember this. It's not just a civil infrastructure. It's not commercial cargoes. This is a humanitarian mission. It's a humanitarian operation the West insisted on, including London and Great Britain. So we provided our guarantees to secure this deal. So we secured it from our side. And armed forces of Ukraine, by attacking with the use of the relevant equipment, made everything to destroy, unless they failed, to destroy the whole chain, the infrastructure chain for this humanitarian project. So if you have some other questions concerning this. No, I've heard your answer. So I'm a good girl, everything remembered. So let's proceed. So you have another question. The last question does not concern the grain deal. It does not concern the situation in Ukraine. It is about elections that took place yesterday to Knesset, where the former the party of the former minister Netanyahu wins. And the question is that on the eve of elections, many mass media in Israel, first of all, with reference to their own resources, said a lot that after the elections, and in case of victory of Likud, the position of Israel can be changed and can become more pro-Ukrainian. In particular, they mentioned that Israel can deliver lethal weapons to Ukraine and not just the humanitarian component as it is now. Does the Ministry of Foreign Affairs make a comment on this? Are there any concerns that that Israel can start such a policy? Of course, the Israeli mass media have their own sources, and you also use all the sources that are available without seeing no secret illusions about open or closed sources. You can have a look. You can analyze what was stated by the current Israeli leadership. You make reference to some Israeli mass media saying that their position can become more pro-Ukrainian or less pro-Ukrainian. It doesn't matter. But I would like to draw your attention that the current leadership of Israel said that they have the only position, and that it is a pro-Western and pro-American position. So that is why I think we should not find any sources, unidentified sources. We'll just base on what is said in open space, that they associated themselves with the Western and American line concerning this policy. I believe that this is their own affair, but in my opinion, the leaders of Israel, it would be beneficial for them to develop cooperations with Russia, which they have done for many years in many spheres. And of course, to listen to the Russian arguments concerning Ukraine, because everything that was the cause that laid in the causes of the conflict in Ukraine has a legal dimension, especially which is so sensitive to Ukraine. This is revival of neo-Nazism, nationalist, inhumane ideology, which is revived. I don't see anything that can obstruct to perceiving our position on the part of Israel. This position is in line with all that Israel has been advocating as a state and as a community. So in my opinion, this goes in line with the national interests of Israel itself. I mean, they share our views. Unfortunately, many of this is not perceived as it should be. As for elections, yes, on the 1st of November, there were held elections. As we see, the official results will be stated not later than the 9th of November. So the government will be formed. I don't think that we need to anticipate the results of these elections by any official comments or other analytics. We believe that the new government will pursue the policy on developing multifaceted cooperation with Russia, which has been demonstrated for many years. As for us, we are ready to this. As for Ukraine, I have just made a comment on it, and our arguments is not only an emotional position. It's not just historical and exclusively our memories. It's an international legal position, and so we defend it. And as for referenda, today I've stated all this in detail. So I believe that in general, our relations with Israel, they should not be just an assessment of any one aspect. They are comprehensive. We respect the sovereign right of Israel for independent policy, and I would like to reiterate its independent policy and to elaborate approaches, their own approaches to international agenda, including the issue of Ukraine. So it would be good if Israel would take into consideration our arguments as well and our interests and concerns as we do with our partners. Thank you.
Let's move to another topic. Do we have Russia сегодня, Russia Today with us? Are you present? Good afternoon, Maria Vladimirovna. You said that the British minister who was called to the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Affairs, there were some evidence of Russia's involvement in the terrorist attacks carried out on the 29th of October. So will the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Affairs voice some assessments in terms of these measures? I have already commented on this issue, and I have already said that there will be some reaction to this issue. Today we have talked a lot about the situation around the Black Sea fleet. I'm talking about the Russian fleet in Sevastopol, but also we talked about sabotage on the Nord Stream 1 and 2, and there is another problem. We are going to speak about it at international venues with our British counterparts as well as competent ministries. Let's proceed to newsroom. Do we have you? Are you present? Yes, we are here. Dear Maria Vladimirovna, we have a couple of questions. The IAEA ministers at Kyiv's request have started an inspection of two facilities in Ukraine and will soon complete it. The IAEA Director General intends to present the results of the inspection later this week. Will Moscow accept these conclusions of the international inspectors? Yes, we look forward to the IAEA investigation. We're going to examine this report, and it will be published, and only after that we will make our assessments and we will make a comment on it. So it is our tradition. First of all, we examine the materials and then we make our conclusions. But I would like to say that the nuclear terrorism from the Kiev regime is real and is dangerous. And my second question, following the meeting with the Russian President Vladimir Putin, the Armenian Prime Minister said that Yerevan is ready to establish interstate relations with Baku based on the principles proposed by Russia. What specific Russian proposals are in questions? And what is about the meeting in Sochi? What issues were discussed? Do we have any agreements reached there? Responding to your first question, I would like to note your attention to the Russian president's words made at the press conference following the trilateral summit in Sochi. So I believe that it is not good to publicly speak about it because it can damage the negotiation track, but I would like to note that President of the Russian Federation said and commented about it in terms of the trilateral summit on the margins of the heads of Russia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan in Sochi. So it were not negotiations between delegations. It was contact, face-to-face contact between three ministers. And of course, this dialogue was held in line with the dialogue that is maintained between the leaders. So it is the only comment that I can make in this regard. Do we have Izvestia with us? Yes, my name is Anton Zalesnitsky. Dear Maria Vladimirovna, you have already said, you have already mentioned this topic, and my other partner have already asked about it. Right now, we can say that the written demands it is enough to resume the grain deal, but right now the relevant issue is about its extension. It expires on November. So can you comment on the Russian prerequisites to prolong this deal? Please do not mix the things. Right now we have witnessed a terrorist attack against an object of civil infrastructure, and we need safeguards, security safeguards to implement this grain deal. Right now the Russian foreign minister said that we have already received these guarantees. Right now we are considering its extension of the deal, and in terms of the extension of this grain deal, then we commented on our requirements and our demands. For example, I mentioned it last time at our last briefing. We will consider these topics according to the situation around the grain deal, but I do not want to make other comments because it will be in detriment of the developments. Please pay attention to my comments I made last briefing at the last briefing. So I believe that right now it is not good to comment more on it because there are two different topics, and I do not want these kind of information to be present. Thank you a lot. Do we have the Republic of Moldova public TV with us? So no, I cannot see you. Let's move on. Then, do we have the China Media Corporation with us? Yes, we are here. We have the following question: the Russian leadership, as well as the Russian president, is ready to negotiate with Ukraine. I would like to quote him: "We're ready to talk with the West on reducing tension, but only if there are realistic proposals based on the equal approach." Does this mean that Russia is ready to negotiate only with the EU countries and the US and not with Ukraine itself? What kind of proposals could be in question, and what would contribute to the resumption of a dialogue? So I believe that you cannot see the statement made by Zelensky or made by the Kiev regime, because this statement has already converted into a federal law. It is a law stating that it is impossible to hold any contacts, hold any dialogue with Russia. So that is why they blocked, the Kiev regime itself blocked the negotiation process. People said that they, by adopting a law, prohibit themselves to carry out any negotiations. So I urge you to address this question to the Kiev regime. It is up to them to answer this. So I would like to remind you one more time that the current crisis in the European security is a direct consequence of a complete lack of agreement of the collective West. And we have had to face this tendency for many years. Since the end of the Cold War, the skills of traditional diplomacy, as well as the search for compromise, have been substituted by blackmail, intimidation. So instead of negotiations, they armed themselves with a disregard this disgraceful attitude towards the views of others, unshakable conviction of their own exclusivity. So they have the rights to decide the world's fate and the world's future. And the culmination of this destructive line was the arrogant refusal of the Westerners to discuss our proposals on security guarantees announced by the Russian side at the end of 2021. And it was not coincidence. It happened because the US had withdrawn from the most agreements that ensured this stability and strategic security. And sometimes they withdrew it, doing it brutally. And we understand other issues. Diplomacy does not like a long vacuum. In the foreseeable future, the world will sit down at the negotiation table at traditional ways to work out new rules of coexistence based on mutual respect and equality in line with the UN principles. We have repeatedly stated that if everything wants the same thing, that is to avoid global catastrophe, great war, global war, and Russia, as you can see, Russia is trying to refrain from taking extreme measures. So we reiterate our readiness for dialogue, but at the same time defending our national security. So if everyone is for peace, for peaceful coexistence, then we need to hear each other, to understand each other, consider the interests and concerns of our partners, despite our preferences. And by the way, I would like to draw your attention on the 31st of October advisor to the head of the Ukrainian President Office, Podolyak, said, I would like to quote him, Russia has lost the opportunity for peace talks with the civilized world. It has no option of going back to January 2022. The only option is a tribunal. So what he's talking about, which the civilized world, he's talking about the garden and jungles. Who's not civilized? China, India, Asia, who are not civilized in their point of view. So we are all representatives of world's nations, and these people, they are not civilized from their stance, but we have long-standing contact with them. So who they call civilized people? These people who do not respect the agreements they themselves signed. That people who divide people into good and bad. These people who are corrupted and who are trying to corrupt the best values, the best traditions for the sake of their own interests. That people who carry out terrorist attacks against civil infrastructure. For example, what happened with the Nord Stream 1 and 2 and with the civil infrastructure in the Black Sea ports. So who are civilized people? That people whose regimes cracked down a number of states in the Middle East, in the region of the North Africa. These people can be considered civilized, but they shelled European countries. For example, Yugoslavia, they shelled it with bombs with uranium. Can they be civilized as? Can they be classified as civilized? They who damaged the fleas with migrants and refugees only because these refugees, only because these people disrupted the livelihoods of these poor countries from where migrants go. So we remember how they shelled, bombed another countries. Can we classify civilized people who fund the terrorist groups in the North Caucasus, these people who killed, murdered children, civilians living peacefully, but we do not believe that they are civilized nation. For us, civilized, they are people who adhere by legal norms. Norms are based on the mutual recognition, mutual respect, considering the interest of each other. For us, it is the civilization. They are people who do not betray others. The peak of civilized people, I believe that is the situation in Afghanistan when for 20 years they destroyed the country. Built um, they built drug drug cartels there due to NATO attempts, and only in one day they abandoned everything. They abandoned their own personnel, their own servicemen. Only in one day they got together and flew from this country. They ran away, and then they even stole the money of Afghan people. And right now they are trying to provide some kind of small financial assistance from these frozen assets. And it is the very example of this so-called civilized world. So if you are going to comment on it, you should know the historical context, the history itself. Even in February, Ukraine initiated the negotiation process and expressed its readiness for compromise until the Anglo-Saxon hold it to withdraw from negotiations with Russia. In this regard, we're still waiting for the Kiev regime clear and unambiguous signals to resume the negotiation process, taking into account the new territorial realities and the situation on the ground. At the same time, if they adhere by this logic, and we believe that it would be wrong to say something about their positions and sides, they themselves should define with whom they are. They coordinate their position with Brussels, with the EU and the US. So we're hearing from that Russia is not ready for dialogue, but still they seem not to see how Kiev itself blocked the negotiation tracks in terms of the engagement with the US and the EU.
We witnessed the well-known methods of just cooperation. It is double standards, blackmail, hypocrisy, and inconsequential actions. Our proposals regarding security safeguards have been rejected, and currently the United States are blackmailing the countries of Asia, Africa, Middle East, and Latin America, forcing them to join the illegal sanctions against Russia. Washington and its allies in NATO continue to pump Ukraine with weapons and are spending billions of dollars for that, while protracting the conflict and doing it especially and continuing the bloodshed. The Russian leadership is always dedicated to diplomatic methods of resolving conflicts. Today, we, as ever, are ready to use this instrument. But once again, we cannot but see the real deal and react to the real situation. That's how I would answer your question. Thank you so much. Do we have, once again, Moldova? If Moldova is with us today, is good afternoon. We had 3 questions now. We have one. The First Asian Department Director, Mr. Zinoviev, said that situation in the Korean Peninsula is degrading. In Pyongyang, they said that the current affairs are leading to war and a nuclear war at that. Perhaps something has changed in 2 days. Could you comment on that? In the recent times, the situation in the Korean Peninsula has aggravated significantly. The reason for that is obvious. Washington's desire to force Pyongyang to unilaterally disarm itself using sanctions and provocations and use the strategic potential and resources of their allies in the Asia-Pacific region. On the 31st of October, the U.S. Air Force and the Republic of Korea Air Force have begun military drills using 240 aircraft, which is essentially a rehearsal of a mass strike against the DPRK territory. We think that sustainable peace in Northeast Asia could be achieved through creation of a system of multilateral, indivisible security with giving corresponding guarantees and safeguards to all stakeholders. And the known Russian and Chinese diplomatic initiatives are directed exactly to that end. Is Anadolu Agency with us today? Yes, good afternoon. We have two questions today. First question dealt with the frozen foreign assets of the Russian Federation. Please tell us, has Russia taken any steps to unfreeze those assets? First of all, I'd like to underline that we think this freezing of Russian assets abroad is as an illegitimate, illicit measure which violates all the norms of international law and business relations. We think such actions and such logic on the part of the West as infringement of on our sovereign property, and such steps of the collective West forced many countries to consider the real reliability of the US dollar and the euro as reserve currencies. There is also a question being raised about the appropriateness of the Western financial architecture for the stable international transactions. Any use of the funds of the Russian state without our consent will be characterized as theft and will cause an adequate response and will influence the sustainability of the world financial system. The Russian authorities are working on possible legal mechanisms regarding the situation. I cannot really delve into details, but I can tell you surely that the work is ongoing. My second question is about the situation between Azerbaijan and Armenia. How would you comment on the efforts taken in regards to the Zangezur corridor, which would link the main Azerbaijani lands? This situation discussed on the Sochi summit, and we think that this cooperation will be continued in the framework of the tripartite work group under the joint chairmanship of the vice prime ministers of both of the three countries, that has been determined in the statement of our three leaders of the countries. Yes, now made alliance of Russian communities. The World Thematic Conference of Compatriots Living Abroad has just begun. It continues to work. How many compatriots have managed to arrive at the conference despite the difficulties with the air traffic? What countries were represented and what questions were raised at the conference? And Madam Zakharova, I would like to congratulate all citizens of the Russian Federation with the upcoming Unity Day. And I would like to congratulate your team. Yes, you too. Thank you. The World Thematic Conference of the Russian Foreign Diaspora, titled Economic Cooperation, Compatriots and Regions of Russia Responding to the Challenges of Time, began yesterday. The welcoming address of Mr. Lavrov was broadcast on the meeting. At the meeting, more than 130 entrepreneurs, heads of entities, and societal activists have taken part in the events. 84 countries have been represented. The conference was broadcast live. I can give you a link to the recording of this, so all the participants could see this conference. The topic of the conference this time has been the cooperation of compatriot organizations with the Russian regions. They've also discussed the possibilities of linking economical potentials of the small and medium businesses in our countries and with our compatriots abroad, and the improvement of the legal framework, and the question of defense of rights and freedoms of Russian compatriots abroad. There have also been a plenary discussion on questions of cooperation with the regions, and there's been discussion on tourism, IT technologies, and small businesses, which have been organized with the cooperation of the government of Moscow. In general, the forum was dedicated to finding common grounds between business organizations of compatriots with these entities of the Russian Federation to foster further consolidation of the Russian diaspora. I would like to clarify whether someone would like to ask more questions. Perhaps someone didn't have the opportunity to ask their questions. Once again, I will repeat that the Republica channel did not have a chance to ask the question. If not, we will answer each question individually. Thank you for your attention. I wish you all well.